Misophonia is a condition in which people can be disproportionately bothered by common sounds. A screaming baby, for example, or someone smacking their food, or perhaps a baby smacking their food while also screaming. If you're afflicted with misophonia, you might have second thoughts about a trip to Japan, where residents reportedly slurp loudly and purposefully during mealtimes to show their appreciation for delicious noodle bowls. Some people believe the country is practically a symphony of slurping and masticating, with restaurants full of patrons making as much noise as possible as a way of complimenting the chef. In fact, the only thing rude about this scenario is assuming that it exists at all. While it's true that many Japanese people do slurp without feeling self-conscious, it's not expected or considered impolite to refrain from doing so. Slurping is done to help draw in air to cool down hot noodle dishes and experience a retronasal smell, or the smells coming through your mouth. Slurping also keeps more of the broth on the noodle. It's more of a food strategy to maximize taste than an eardrum-shattering cultural custom. You don't have to do it, and no one will throw you a dirty look for skipping it. Some Japanese people have even raised concern that slurping too loudly might turn off Western tourists and suggested minimizing the practice. Noodle etiquette is just one of the facets of Japanese culture long misunderstood that we'll be covering in this installment of Misconceptions. Let's hit it. Hi, I'm Justin Dodd, and heaven knows I've slurped residual milk from a bowl of honey bunches of oats many a time in my life. Yet I wouldn't expect anyone outside of the US to assume all Americans inhale cereal. But that's just part of what many of us do when faced with cultures experienced only through fleeting media images or word of mouth. For Japan, that's meant enduring a lot of long-held stereotypes about food, samurai spirit, and an unyielding work ethic. All tropes that have contributed to exoticizing the country for many people in the West. During World War II, that went a whole lot further to outright demonization with racist caricatures and the unjust imprisonment of Japanese Americans. Today, we still tend to think of Japan as tech-obsessed, crowded, and home to some truly wild game shows. So let's examine it and see if we can break some illusions about this very influential and often misunderstood country. And I will try to refrain from slurping. Japan is on the cutting edge of tech. Since the salad days of the Sony Walkman in the 1980s, Americans have classified Japanese people as being a culture obsessed with the latest and greatest gadgets. Electronics marketing helped reinforce that point. Sony televisions were pricey. Most household devices like VHS and DVD players had Japanese origins. We bought Panasonic phones, listened to Duran Duran on Sanyo audio equipment, and sat in front of Hitachi big screens. It all gave way to a sense that a typical Japanese household must be living in the future with robot butlers and toilets that talk to you. While there are undoubtedly gadget-obsessed residents just like anywhere else, on the whole, the Japan tech scene isn't necessarily light years ahead of here or anywhere. And in certain areas, it's actually lagging a bit behind. For example, plenty of Japanese businesses still use fax machines, where sending and receiving messages on paper is a common form of communication. What about streaming services? In the States, about 85% of consumers have at least one streaming service like Netflix. In Japan, it's only 46%. And much like the US preoccupation with collecting vintage records, Japan has a bustling retro music scene, but it may be more for cassette tapes at the moment. In 2021, Vice reported that Gen Z in Japan has become invested in the analog format, both for library titles and new music. Enthusiasts like making their own mixtapes and taking cassette players to the beach. Tape manufacturer Maxell still makes 8 million of them annually. According to the BBC, things like handwritten faxes, tapes, and outdated software are likely a product of small independent businesses making up most of the commercial landscape in the country. Without major corporations mandating new tech and ultra-efficient advancements, many people in Japan are content to keep things relatively simple at work and at home. One area where Japan may deserve its future forward reputation is in their toilets. The Toto brand is immensely popular there, with their toilets greeting users and offering an array of amenities from bidets to music that help mask the sounds of passage. I must caution you, if you're not familiar with the system, it can be a little confusing. I do not recommend pushing any toilet buttons without a full understanding of their features. You've been warned. Everyone eats sushi. Raw fish wrapped in a roll? What could go wrong? Well, if you buy it at a gas station, a lot of things that may tax your Toto toilet, but an even bigger lapse in judgment is in assuming Japanese people are obsessed with sushi or even that it necessarily originated there. Japan absolutely popularized sushi, but arguably the first mention of it can be found as far back as 1600 years ago in China and Thailand, where fish was placed in rice for fermentation. Acid from the rice along with the salt helped to kill bacteria in the fish and allowed for it to be kept longer, a necessary life hack in a world without refrigerators. Then, in the 1820s, a man named Hanaya Yohei marketed fish on top of hand-squeezed rice, introducing a more modern concept of sushi to Japan and eventually the globe. You might say sushi is to Japan what hamburgers are to America. Popular for sure, and internationally recognized. But we don't eat hamburgers every day. I mean, at least I do not, you do you. Of course, it depends on the individual person and the price point of the specific restaurant, but sushi is not generally an everyday part of diets in Japan the way, say, oatmeal or eggs might be for Americans. What's more, what we think of as sushi isn't necessarily what you'd find in Japan. Popular sushi dishes in the US, like spicy tuna rolls, aren't common there. The same goes for avocado and many other ingredients. You can also stop practicing your chopsticks game in advance of your sushi outing. Most people in Japan eat sushi with their hands, not with any utensils, although it's certainly acceptable to break out the sticks. So if they're not digging into the spicy tuna, what is a common diet in Japan? Like anywhere else, it's difficult to generalize. You can get as much junk food as you like there, much of it putting our American snacks to shame. But when sticking to a healthy diet, Japanese people as a whole tend to consume soybean products, fresh fish and meat, rice, fruits, vegetables, and green tea. One last misconception about sushi. It doesn't necessarily mean raw fish. Sushi translates to something like it is sour and refers to the taste. Of course, sushi can and often does contain raw fish, known as sashimi, but it doesn't have to, nor does it have to contain rice, as I discussed in our episode of Food History all about the not-so-Japanese California roll. Japan is super expensive. Listen to some of the hype surrounding Tokyo and you can quickly get the idea that it's an impossibly expensive place to live or even visit, like New York or Singapore. Truth is, the cost of living in Japan isn't as steep as you might think. While definitely more costly in terms of food, lodging, and entertainment than some countries, Japan is actually less expensive than Switzerland, England, or Australia. If you want to go the ultra budget route, you can find a hostel in Kyoto for as little as $25 a night. Riding the train or subway runs a few dollars per trip, and you can get excellent meals to slurp or not for less than $15. Local convenience store box food is as little as $4. Obviously, you can spend as much as you like on fine dining and five-star hotels, but it's not wholly necessary in order to explore the country. Well, what if you live there? It's true that Tokyo is among the most expensive cities in the world, but that doesn't mean you don't have options. One blogger, Margarita Pittori, recently estimated a studio apartment in Tokyo can be had for as little as $727 a month. That can go up or down depending on the part of the city you choose, but it's vastly cheaper than comparable rentals in major US cities. Expenses like utilities and internet are also pretty reasonable. Overall, Japan can certainly be affordable, particularly if you settle down in a more rural community and take advantage of the country's efficient public transportation system. Like most anywhere, it depends on which luxuries or amenities you want and which you can do without. It also depends on how close you want to live to the major metropolitan areas, which brings us to our next misconception. Japan is crowded. When the media covers Japan, a lot of focus gets put on their population density. Tokyo is the most populous metropolitan area with 37 million residents, and some stories have highlighted the ultimate in tiny living. Apartments as small as 95 square feet that are barely functional as anything but a place to sleep. That's on top of footage of bustling Tokyo intersections. If you go by that, living in Japan must feel like living in an elevator. But is Japan really that teeming with humanity? While it's true Tokyo is a hub of work and play, most of Japan is not really like that. It would be like saying New York State is impossible to get around in because Times Square is so packed. The truth is, the desire to be near major cities like Tokyo, Osaka, or Nagoya has left over half of Japan's municipalities in danger of being designated as underpopulated. Millions of unoccupied homes sit on the real estate market. According to CNN, the small village of Nagoro, home to more than 300 people a few decades ago, now has just 30 residents, none under the age of 50. The problem of Tokyo being overpopulated and the rest of Japan being relatively sparse has grown so severe that Japan's government is offering financial incentives for families to move into more rural areas. Families will get about 1 million yen or $7,700 for each child if they move. Nationally, Japan is also facing stagnant population growth. 2017, for example, there were more deaths than births, with Tokyo residents producing a fertility rate of 1.17. It's possible that by 2050, Japan's entire population could fall from about 125 million today to under 100 million. Some experts believe career demands, like those seen in and around Tokyo, are partially to blame for fewer people wanting offspring. It's concerning enough that in the town of Nagi, officials pay couples about 100,000 yen or $900 to have a child, with another $1,300 for having a second child. Not sure how that works with twins. So, could you feel cramped in Tokyo or another major city? Sure. But on the whole, Japan is not overstuffed, and some places even want to bribe residents into reproducing. When you are in a crowd, you might notice a lot of people wearing masks, a custom that's become something of an entrenched practice in Japan, but not for the reason you may think. Masks are worn only to avoid getting sick. While most of the world had a serious societal shock in 2020 when masks became a regular part of the day, Japan didn't need much adjustment. Masking has been part of the country's culture for decades, and while avoiding illness is definitely part of the reason, there's a bit more to it than that. A number of Japanese people don masks to minimize symptoms of hay fever and other allergic reactions to airborne irritants. In fact, use of the masks in the country can be traced back to the 19th century, when miners wore them to reduce their exposure to dust. After the 1918 flu pandemic, they became an everyday accessory for many residents. Usage picked up considerably in 2011 after the Fukushima nuclear reactor disaster, with some Japanese people believing the masks could prevent inhalation of radioactive debris. All of this has contributed to a societal acceptance of mask wearing. It's not strictly about health. Sometimes a person will put one on if they don't feel like wearing makeup, or even to avoid social interactions. And members of the notorious Bozo-zoku biker gang have been known to wear them to avoid being identified in case they feel like doing crime. So yes, reducing chances of spreading or catching germs is a factor, but not the sole motivation. They might just be worried about allergies, or using it as a fashion accessory, or thinking about robbing an ATM. Japanese game shows are weird and dangerous. I presume you're watching this video on YouTube and not, say, through the window while we film, which means you've probably come across clips of audacious Japanese game shows. Shows where contestants endure freezing temperatures or play human curling. Some associate Japan's game shows with outright sadism, but this is another example of taking the most extreme sample and applying it to an entire genre. According to The Atlantic, televised Japanese game shows began in the 1950s, around the same time as their American counterparts. They were pretty benign, with things like charades getting primetime treatment. Then, in the 1980s, a show called Takeshi's Castle began airing. The show featured competitors trying to storm a castle while having things tossed at them, all while wearing embarrassing costumes. Because Takeshi's Castle was syndicated around the world with sometimes dubious dubbing that made the content seem even more incredible, it came to define the supposedly outrageous Japanese game show culture. And in fairness, some producers then embraced the conceit with a series of shows featuring plenty of titillating or humiliating components in the 1990s. But these shows were largely outliers, even in Japan. They often aired later at night and were far from appointment viewing. There was even a push for new broadcasting standards to tone down their more sexual or extreme content, and by 2000, many of these programs succumbed to the public pressure to get off the air. In the end, while a lot of seemingly absurd shows have emerged from Japan, they suffer from a kind of selection bias. But think of it this way. What if American networks decided to unload game shows like Fear Factor to other countries and nothing else? No Top Chef, no Jeopardy. There's a good chance international viewers would think American audiences only wanted to watch contestants eat bull testicles and spiders, and we would feel a great national shame, especially since millions of us did indeed watch Joe Rogan tell people to eat bull testicles for cash, and we'd all probably like to forget that. As for Takeshi's Castle, it's actually coming back this year. Amazon Prime has plans to air it in the US, which means a new generation will probably be led to believe all Japanese game shows are bonkers. Tattoos are illegal. Our last misconception does have a large element of truth to it. In Japan, it's common for public establishments like gyms, pools, and bathhouses to ban people with visible tattoos. The reason is that body art has often been synonymous with organized crime or the Yakuza. According to anthropologist Margot de Mello, the story goes that in the 19th century, tattoos were actually banned, so only people on the margins of society would end up getting them, say, gang members. When the ban was lifted in 1948, tattooing was so far underground that most decent Japanese citizens would not consider becoming tattooed. In onsen, or hot spring baths, proprietors who wanted to keep Yakuza from the premises declared a blanket ban on anyone with a tattoo. It was easier than trying to single out Yakuza, which might bring about some unpleasant reprisal. Other businesses sometimes followed suit. But this is something that's been changing, and rapidly. In recent years, a growing number of younger Japanese people have been opting for body art as a means of self-expression. According to the New York Times, the number of citizens with tattoos has doubled from around 700,000 in 2014 to 1.4 million today, representing a significant increase in acceptance. In 2020, Japan's Supreme Court ruled that anyone with proper training could perform tattoo work instead of strictly medical professionals, which means more tattoo parlors are opening. And more bathhouses and onsen are admitting those with tattoos, which is good because I am planning a trip there this year and I really don't want to get kicked out of the bath. Even though there's still a stigma associated with tattoos, with some employers frowning upon them, aficionados are demanding that Japanese society learn to live with ink. Call it a misconception in progress. Did we leave out any important misconceptions? If so, you can drop a comment below or check out Mental Floss's new Discord server. It's at discord.io/mentalfloss, and if that's too much to remember, we put a link down in the description below. Like me, the Discord is young but promising. Please don't comment about that assessment anywhere, thank you. It's a great place to suggest topics for future videos, get access to unique content, and learn alongside other knowledge lovers from around the world. I'm Justin Dodd, and thanks for watching. I will now return to learning about the Toto toilet control panel.